CapitaLands has grown to become one of Asia's largest developers. I'm joined by Mr. Arthur Lang, CapitaLand Group CFO, to talk about Asia's burgeoning real estate market and potential future investments. Mr. Lang, which countries are you targeting for growth and why?
CapitaLand today is in almost 20 countries all over the world, even in Europe and in the UK, where our service apartments are. But really the focus is very much on Singapore and China. I think for Singapore and China alone today, it's about 75 to 80% of total assets for the group. I think if you look at all the projects and the activities we're involved in these two countries, I think in the next 5 years, I wouldn't be surprised if it's about 85% of our total assets and total business. Specifically, if you look at China, right? China, I mean, it's perhaps the biggest, it's the best place to do business in Asia. I mean, with 1.3, 1.4 billion people, it's a huge market. I think more importantly as well, urbanization rates in China are still relatively low compared to the developed world. It's still in the 50% area. Most of the developed countries are in the 80s or even in the 90s in terms of the population that's urbanized.
Well, staying on the subject of China, and we obviously hear an awful lot about the potential in the country, but there is a lot of talk about a possible housing bubble. How much of a problem do you see this being?
With the new government, I think we are still fundamentally confident with the residential sector, the property market in China. The reason I mentioned earlier is the urbanization rates for China is still relatively low compared to other large countries. So there's still a lot of room for growth. I think we're also very encouraged by the recent measures from the Chinese government to cool the residential sector down and not create bubbles. Because I think for real estate companies, what we really like is sustainable growth, where hence investments, when we can make proper investments, we can make judgments in terms of which cities to invest in. If there are a lot of bubbles, I think things get a bit too volatile and it's quite disruptive to a business, because real estate is a very long-term business and actually we want it to grow sustainably.
I mean, would you say the housing bubble is perhaps less of concern in places like China because there's so much demand for housing there?
It really depends on which city we're looking at. I mean, China has about, I can't remember the statistics, but there are more than 600 cities with populations of at least 1 million. Right, so we can't be in every city, I think, and each city has its own dynamic, has its own regulatory requirements, has its own market demand dynamics. So we need to look at each city. I mean, China as a whole, we are very bullish on its overall economic performance over the next 10, 20 years. But I think also at the city level, we have to look at and see where we want to place our bets.
So moving on to Singapore now, where CapitaLand is based. And the property market there has been flourishing due to low interest rates. So how do you see the new total debt servicing ratio impacting the market?
There have been a series of property cooling measures instituted by the government for the last 3 years. And I would say, and the final one being, or the last one being the total debt service ratio, TDSR. I would say cumulatively, that has actually moderated the residential market in Singapore. Now, in terms of what we think of the prospects, the fundamentals are still there for Singapore. Population growth is still increasing, and I think the government is still wanting to make sure Singapore is a great place to live as well as a place to do business.
CapitaLand has achieved great success over the past few years, in part because you haven't relied on one source of funding. So why do you think it's important to diversify sources of capital?
The real estate development is a very long gestation period, meaning that at the point of buying the land and when you actually spend capital and put in capital to buy the land and to build, you don't see that capital coming back to you until a few years later. I mean, in certain very large projects, it could take 7, 8 years before you actually see the capital return. Two, I think real estate fundamentally or inherently is a very cyclical business. There are peaks, there are troughs. We talked about bubbles earlier. So I think one needs to understand the cyclicality of the industry. Three, I would say that right now, especially in Asia, right, where we are focused on our cities in Asia, the ticket size or real estate has become a very capital-intensive business. For example, in Singapore, I always tell my colleagues, any office building in the CBD in Singapore costs you at least $1 billion. So large amounts of capital are actually needed to actually, make sizable investments in Asia.
Well, finally, I think the question most people want answering is, so where's the next big thing? Where will you next be targeting for investment?
I think we've got our hands full in Singapore and China. It's definitely these two countries where, as I mentioned earlier, we're fundamentally very confident about the prospects of these two countries, and we still want to continue to grow there.
Will you maybe be going to sort of more third tier or even fourth tier cities rather than just the major cities like Shanghai, Chongqing?
I think at this point, if you look at, we are probably about 90% of our China business is concentrated in about 10 to 11 cities in China. I think what we want is to really go deepen our presence in these cities. So what we have done is we have actually created 5 city clusters at CapitaLand within China for our China business. And each city cluster is anchored by one of the major cities. So in the northern part of China, we have Beijing. In the eastern part of China, we have Shanghai. Then in the southern, we have Guangzhou. Central, we have Wuhan. And then in the southwestern, we have Chengdu, Chongqing. So I would say at this point, we're still very much focused on these 5 city clusters, but always keep your options open. So, maybe next year there might be a 6 city cluster, but at this point it's 5.
Mr. Lang, thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you very much.